Welcome to the smartest people in the room. We are glad you are here, and just by showing up, you're already demonstrating your very own smarts. Today, I am pleased to present two people who represent perfectly the name of this platform, the smartest people in any room they enter. And I promise you will leave smarter and more enlightened than you arrived. Before we get started, please let me take care of some business. First, to the audience, please feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat window. The reason we do these webinars is twofold. First, we want to showcase really smart people and the amazing work they do day to day in the music industry. But the second reason is a bit more nuanced. Many of you know that I am a music industry headhunter. I run the music practice at Turnkey ZRG, and I place music executives in roles throughout the industry. So by definition and function, I help people connect with companies. In this series, my goal is to help you make more connections, and I invite you to take full advantage of that opportunity. Specifically, I invite you to engage with the speakers and the other attendees in the chat of the Zoom. Please introduce yourselves, share your LinkedIn profile, say hello to your friends, and make some new ones, and ask questions of our speakers. And also, this is very important for everyone. That is, make sure your chat is set to address everyone, not just the host and speakers. And by the way, Chris, that goes for you and Will too. I want to thank our program sponsors for without their support, we could not keep this free. Special thanks to MedJet, Tennessee Brewworks, Turnkey ZRG, the Tennessee Entertainment Commission, and Better Than Booze. So let's get down to business. In today's host seat, we welcome the incomparable Will Page. He is the author of the critically acclaimed book Tarzan Economics, which has been translated into 5 languages and published in paperback under the title Pivot. As the former chief economist at Spotify and PRS for Music, Will pioneered concepts called rockonomics and shined a light on globalization, both of which we will talk about today. Those concepts show why and how local artists singing in their mother tongues are topping the charts on global streaming platforms. At Spotify, Will launched his ongoing and widely anticipated annual report on the global value of music copyright. And at PRS, he saved BBC 6 Music. A passionate communicator, he's a regular contributor to the BBC, Financial Times, and The Economist. Will also serves as a fellow at the London School of Economics, Edinburgh Futures Institute, and the Royal Society of Arts. Welcome, Will. It is an honor to have you with us today.
It's like a boomerang. It's great to be back.
Awesome. And joining as our featured guest today is Chris Riva Dalla. Chris lives at the intersection of music and data. Playing in bands and recording music since his teenage years, he is currently a senior product manager at AudioMac, where he focuses on data analytics and personalization. Outside of his day job, he writes the popular newsletter called Can't Get Much Higher and has had his work featured by The Economist, Business Insider, and NPR, among many others. His debut book called Uncharted Territory, What Numbers Tell Us About the Biggest Hit Songs and Ourselves, will be released on November the 13th via Bloomsbury. Ladies and gentlemen, it is an honor to welcome these two rock stars to our platform today. Take it away, boys.
Well, thank you, Tom, and thank you for this gathering of what I like to call inquisitive minds. You can't ask for any more in the music industry. People who keep asking questions. In this business, you can never stop asking questions. And Chris, your work always makes me ask questions. It always makes me think around corners, you know? Let's start with your name. I've got a boring name, Page. I mean, what pages have there been in the music business other than Jimmy? No relation. My mother wasn't a groupie in the 70s. Or Larry. But Dalla Riva, where is that name from?
It is it's Italian. I believe it directly translates to from the coast. But the two-word last I like having, a unique last name, though the two-word last name has occasionally caused me issues with filling out forms and breaking computer systems that they don't think should have spaces, but do in my case. So yeah, of Italian heritage.
Well, I want to kick it off by quoting a longtime mentor of mine, Mr. Ralph Simon, who I believe will be in the audience today. But he once famously said, the music industry is always about asking what's happening next. And then he said, it always has been. I always liked that kind of retrospective, forward-looking vibe to that flippant remark from Ralph Simon. And there's just something about your work which we're going to unpack over the next hour, which is you're hungry. You're never standing still. And this audience is hungry. They're here because they're hungry. They want to learn. So what fuels the hunger? You wake up in the bed in the morning and think, what's nobody thought about that I can write about? Like, what's driving that?
I general curiosity, but I keep a notebook, and when I think of something that I think is interesting, I usually just write it down in the notebook, and then every week when I write my newsletter, I just flip through it, and I'm like, oh, let's try to answer this question, whatever it may be, or look into this. And it strikes me that usually if you think something is interesting, somebody else will, but also the more you dig into something, usually the more interesting it becomes. Things that are even things on the surface that seem boring, usually as you dig into their history or the way people are using them, there's always a lot going on and there's a lot to share about it. So that's what
Well,
keeps me
let's
going. And I
just
feel like the more you dig is where this stuff comes from.
let's press pause there because let's get this audience's jaws to drop to the floor because it's going to happen a few times in this conversation. But give me the example of the most boring dead end cul-de-sac you were in with that brilliant brain of yours, which actually turned out to be a completely inspirational, game-changing observation once you dug a little deeper. When did you scratch the surface and find gold?
I guess something that comes to mind recently was a coworker of mine jokingly was asking me about, oh, who's the greatest two-hit wonder of all time? One-hit wonder, two-hit wonder, you have two hits.
That's brilliant.
So, of course, I just pull the chart data history. I think, all right, let's find artists that have two hits and we'll sort them by their popularity on Spotify. And I do that, and the number one answer, or the biggest two-hit wonder of all time was Pink Floyd. And I was like, what? That can't be right. But I was looking at a US chart, and Pink Floyd didn't release a ton of singles in the US, but they only had two top 40 singles in the US. So you end up with this weird result saying that Pink Floyd, one of the greatest selling bands of all time, is the biggest two-hit wonder of all time. And then you start having to refine how you define a two-hit wonder and what you're looking for. And that strikes me as something that's interesting because when you're using data and to look at music, you have to be very careful with how you define things, or you end up getting strange or weird results that wouldn't make sense on the surface.
Context, context, context. And on one-hit wonders and two-hit wonders, a great example of something I've done in that space is looking at the impact vinyl's having on the music industry. A lot of Americans on the call. It's incredible to think that last year, vinyl in America alone created US record labels $1 billion in revenue,
I'm
wholesale. That's a
I'm curious.
first-hand market, $1 billion business in 2025 of spinning the platters that matter. Now, we know the majority of those people buying those records don't own a record player. Small fact, could be relevant. But when I teach the economics of vinyl, I talk about one hit, two hit wonders. I always quote Saturday Night Fever. Now, when I say Saturday Night Fever to Chris Dalla Riva, what's the one song that jumps out in your mind?
Staying Alive by the Bee Gees.
Correct. And it's I think still, we'll have to fact check this, either the most selling vinyl record of all time or second behind Thriller. But it sold shitloads.
Yeah.
Did you ever listen to the song Calypso Breakdown by Randy McDonald?
No, I don't think so.
I don't think Randy McDonald's listened to the song Calypso Breakdown by Randy McDonald.
Is
But
that on
when
the
you think about
soundtrack?
selling a vinyl record as opposed to streaming, in streaming, the killer makes bank and the filler gets nothing. But in vinyl, Randy McDonald got the same mechanical royalty as Staying Alive by the Bee Gees. Isn't that messed up?
It's I've thought about this a lot. I was talking to a songwriter, I believe her name is Shelley Pekin. She wrote a couple hits in the 90s. And she talked about how in the late 80s, you could make a career as a songwriter just by writing album tracks for, pop stars who would sell a ton of albums based off of one or two singles. And now that career really doesn't exist anymore. You have to you have to be writing the single or you're not going to collect the royalties. I think that makes it harder for young songwriters to break in because, album cuts aren't going to be worth as much.
There's no
But
fun in fillers.
no, but it does, to your point that like in the abstract, you're like, all right, you should make the most money if you're the one who's actually driving the sales.
I
Uh,
know. I know, but we digress, but we don't digress, but we digress. I want to bring it back to you as our starter before we get to the main course. I want to ask a simple question. Do you sleep? And let
Ah,
me preface that with, you got a full-time gig. I want you to tell the audience about that. You have a Substack. We're going to get to that. You have a book. We're going to do. How do you pack it all in? Because we're going to unpack it the next 45 minutes. But how do you pack it all in?
yeah, I'm certainly a bit of a night owl.
I'm not surprised.
Yeah, I work and I work for Audio Mac, which is a music streaming service. I would say it's more in like the SoundCloud universe, so users can upload directly. Though we have music license from all the major labels and smaller labels, and the service is tremendously popular in Africa and the Caribbean. And I work on data and personalization, so everything to figuring out what are people listening to on the platform, to trying to surface information to help our internal employees see how features are being used. And I felt like I really learned the music and data trade there just by being baptized in fire. I mean, we're a small team, so I get dragged into so many different things across the business. And it's a job that it definitely affords flexibility and they're supportive of my other endeavors, but you got to balance your time carefully and you certainly stay up late sometimes.
A lot of chocolate biscuits and Earl Grey tea is my usual recipe. Yeah, and I just quickly say, I appreciate the comparison to SoundCloud, the way you describe your current employer, Audio Mac, and I'm hearing good things about it. I got to be honest, haven't used it, but I know you've got some great people over there doing some great work. Now, I want to use the word drip feed here because we're going to get to your book, we're going to get to your newsletter, but you're up all night, you don't sleep, you spin a lot of plates, you catch a lot of bombs. But it's worthwhile because you give. You ain't a taker, you're a giver. I don't pay you anything, but I get pounded with inspirational ideas. Just give us your greatest hits. You talked about the best two-track band ever. Give us your top two tracks in terms of Chris Dalla Riva observations, which is going to knock this audience out.
Certainly my greatest hit all time online was I wrote an article years ago about how there are fewer key changes in popular songs these days. And there was a nice little chart that went with it. And you see, like, from the 1960s to the 1980s, about 20% of number one hits have a key change. And then around 2003, this just falls off to zero. Now, I think this ended up going super viral because people would look at this and say, oh, popular music has no sophistication these days. People don't know how to write songs. In reality, most of those older key changes were what some people call like a gear shift key change. It's the last chorus, you go up a half step or a whole step, like Living on a Prayer by Bon Jovi or I Want to Dance with Somebody. So not injects energy, but not a super sophisticated songwriting move. But this is every couple months, or at least a couple times a year, this graphic gets shared again, and people just start arguing about key changes and what this means about popular music, in the future of popular music. So that's certainly my greatest hit.
Can I just quickly pull you up on that Bon Jovi reference? Because I actually cite that in my book, Tars and Economics as a hardback, Pivot as it's retitled as a paperback. Thank you. And for
Yes.
the audience's benefit, why did you change the title of your first ever book? It's because Hudson Travel and W.H. Smith approached my publisher, Simon Schuster, and said, we love Will's book. We really want to get behind it. We'll even put it on our tables in airports, which is like the Nobel Prize for a first-time author. But books with economics in their title don't sell at airports. So get rid of that name, get rid of that brand, and come back with something that does. And we rebranded it, we retitled it Pivot. And I remember flying to Austin, Texas, and my flight was delayed by 6 hours. So I went to every WH Smith at Heathrow, and there it was. They kept their promise. So if there's any budding authors out there, don't put economics in your book title because you ain't going to be sold in airports. Lesson told. In that book, I bring up the Bon Jovi example, which is Living on a Prayer, verse, chorus, famous guitar solo, air guitar solo of the year, and back into the chorus. And then something happens. Can you explain to this audience, either musically or mathematically, what happens?
Yeah, so this is the big key change moment. I don't know what
The biggest key change moment in the history of rock.
Yeah, I mean the way I think about musical keys is it's a menu of notes that you're going to build your composition around. And if you shift the key, you are shifting the choice of notes that you're building your
Yeah.
song around. You can do this again in very, very sophisticated ways because not all key changes work back one to another, or they're not easy to use as deftly. But the most popular one throughout the second half of the 20th century, like I said, some people call it like the truck driver's key change or the gear shift key change, where you're going up, if you're in the key of A, maybe you go to A sharp for the last chorus, maybe you go to B for the last chorus, and it just injects a ton of energy. And Living on a Prayer is maybe the quintessential example of this because the injection of energy in the last chorus is uh, insane. And as I'm talking here from New Jersey, I'm glad New Jersey native Bon Jovi could have the pleasure of that crazy key change.
You're from New Jersey, where they drink beer out of cans. Always remember that description John Bon Jovi gave to his homeland. We drink beer out of cans.
But they don't do that anywhere else.
We're not going to get a cancer cure out of that one, but still, it is an incredible key change. And the way I was described was if you sing Living on a Prayer at a karaoke, it's the hardest song ever to sing because firstly you have to sing the song, and then as you go into that key change, you have to sing the whole song again because you have to
Yeah.
kind of restructure your voice. So if you ever want to be found out at karaoke, try singing Bon Jovi's Living on a Prayer. Great. So we got a kind of nice picture of who you are. We'll get to the book and we'll get to the Substack, and I would love to get everybody in this audience here to be on that Substack and pre-ordering that book because it really is inspirational information. But let's turn to the G word and how we met, essentially. I was aware of your work, and I'll just give the audience a bit of background here. The paperback edition of my book, Pivot, came out. I was asked to go on the BBC One show to promote it. Strange Place to Put Me, a sort of family-friendly on the sofa TV show in the UK. And they had this family-friendly feel-good story. They said, "Hey, Will, isn't it great that the top 10 songs last year in Britain were all British artists? Isn't that fantastic? The Brits have got a clean sweep for the first time in 60 years." And I made a complete car crash in the interview because they're not really. The top 10 in Germany are all German, top 20 in France are all French, the top 40 in Italy are all Italian, and the entire Spanish chart, Spanish language, but all Latinos. And there's these gulps on the sofa, didn't do my book sales any favor, not asked to go back on the BBC One show. All right, you drink that one off. But the gulps made me interested. Why were they gulping? Why were they gulping that Europe had gone all European, whereas Brits were all gone all British? Why was that upsetting to them? Did they expect us to conquer Europe as well? And that made me wonder, is there something going on here? And that made me approach you to say, I think I've got something here. There's a bug in my bass bin and I want to unpack it. And can you help me unpack it? Now, to tee this up for you to explain to the audience where we went with this paper, I'm going to use the B word and the C word. And conscious of Scottish stereotypes, and this will not involve profanities. The B word is globalization. And that's what I was taught at university back in the Victorian times, which is that the world is flat and we have a homogenized society and we all go to McDonald's and we all go to Starbucks. That was a theory of globalization. And if there are people in their 40s on this call, you may remember the protests against the World Trade Organization opposing globalization and what it was doing to emerging countries. The world is flat. Then in 1995, a long time ago, a sociologist, not an economist, not for the first time economists have been found out to be full of shit. A sociologist says the world ain't flat, and he looks at Koreans living in Los Angeles, K-Town. He said if globalization was true, these Koreans would be going to McDonald's and Starbucks, but they're not. They're going to Korean delis and Korean restaurants. They're going to where it feels closest to home, and diversity wins. And now we have the unpronounceable, tongue-twisting hybrid of a word, globalization. Now, the sociologist Roland Robinson passed away in 2022, tragically, a year to the day when Will Page and Christella Riva published an unsuspecting London School of Economics discussion paper called Globalization. And before I hand it over to you, let me announce to the audience that discussion paper is now the most read paper on the London School of Economics website, which tells you how shit their website is. Chris, explain globalization to this audience and what we uncovered.
Yeah, so I mean, McDonald's, I feel like was a good example that we came across while we were thinking about this. Is of course you think you could walk into a McDonald's anywhere on Earth, and you're going to be able to get, a Big Mac or whatever. But if you go to a McDonald's in India, the menu is very different than the menu in, if you were to walk in London or in New York. The idea being that that McDonald's brand is global, but they are going to localize parts of that menu to work with the local culture in the area. Will and I were curious about this in the music world because for decades, economies of scale made it such that if CBS Records wanted to promote Michael Jackson around the world, it makes most sense for them to print up a gazillion copies of Thriller, ship it all over the world, than it does to have different artists in each different region have their vinyl made up and shipped. It's less efficient. But what we've seen in the internet age is that anyone can upload music anywhere. It's completely democratized. And because of that, if you look at, say, the Italian charts 20 years ago, they were dominated by American and British acts. But if you look at the
And Germany too.
Italian charts today, it's dominated not only by Italian acts, but Italian acts singing in Italian. And Will and I looked at a bunch of countries throughout Europe and we saw the same pattern again and again in most places that as streaming has taken hold, as the ability for anyone to distribute their music around the world has taken hold, actually local music has become more popular in these countries, which goes against this flattening theory of globalization. It actually made it seem like things were becoming more diversified rather than less diversified or flat.
And that lit a fuse. I mean, it's just a 25-minute read LSE discussion paper, but it really lit a fuse. And it's just, I think, one of the most cited words in the business now. And only a few weeks ago in Southeast Asia, there was a sports conference called the Globalization of Sport with our paper cited in the forwarding notes. So we don't have copyright on the word, nor should we. It was a sociologist who came up with it. We should have registered that word at the PRS, but it's incredible to just stumble on something. This is art, right? You don't know what's around the corner. You stumble on this. And I always like to say we're defining this word in real time. I'll get a question from the floor here in this wonderful audience, which is going to change what I think it means. But my current definition puts me at odds with you. I want to punch you, Chris, because my current definition is that if you are from a non-English speaking country with a strong national identity, Germany, France, Spain, Italy, Sweden, Sweden, 8 of the top 10 artists last year were Swedish who are choosing to sing in Swedish. And the two imposters were Taylor Swift and The Weeknd. You know why that's ironic? They both had Swedish songwriters. If you're from a non-English speaking country with a strong national identity, localization is a force for good. If, however, you are from an English speaking country, you're not American, you're kind of screwed because our industry is on its knees. Canada's getting marginalized. And Australia, if you want to use the words market failure, have a look at what's going on in Australia right now. There's just no Australian artists coming through the pipes. Do you agree with that current definition? Would you challenge it? And if there is substance to what I'm suggesting, and if I'm wrong, I throw my hands up. If there is substance to it, why?
Well, I think in general you are correct there. I don't, and of course, local countries want to promote usually art coming from within the country, but I think in general it's better for music that people in any country can upload their music, and someone in the UK can listen to, Brazilian music or Swedish music probably more easily than they could 30 or 40 years ago. So even though uh, the UK has not benefited as much from these localizing forces, I think there is still something good from it in that UK artists still have the ability to cross over in other countries. Other artists can also cross over in the UK in a way that probably would have been difficult for them to do decades ago. So I think in general, it's a force for good, even though certain countries are not going to be as happy with the results as others.
I will put a footnote to this, and it's a can of worms that we do not have time to open, but I think the algorithm has something to do with this as well. If you're German and you listen to German rock, the algorithm knows that language is a driver, so let's serve you up lots of German rock. If you're Danish, it's Danish rock. If you're Brazilian, it's Brazilian rock. But if you're English speaking, the algorithm migrates to American rock just through the
Yeah.
law of large numbers. And I just wanted to do something which you shouldn't really do on these calls, but if I can, please just go to screen share for this audience's benefit. So for those with just ears, I need your eyes for a second. Tune in on this one. This isn't fabricated. This is just a spot check. This is how I prove globalization is real. Brazil, big country. Big country, top 10 global music market in the world. You can go and visit this yourselves. This is the weekly top 100 artists in Brazil. Everybody in Brazil uses YouTube, so it can affect culture. And if I just do this at a good pace, I want you to say stop when you see an English speaking or a Spanish speaking or even a Portuguese native artist. Okay, so I'm just going to keep going fast. Nope, all Portuguese Brazilians, all Brazilians performing in Portuguese. We're getting out the top 50 now. You see what's happening here? And we're going now into the 75 region, still Brazilian, still Brazilian, still Brazilian. And we keep going. This is getting kind of fucked up now because we're going to get to the top 100 and not see Taylor Swift. Not, oh, we've got Lady Gaga at 85. There's one. And we might get Bruno Mars at the very end. No, Bruno's dropped out. There you go. 99 of those 100 artists are Brazilian performing in Portuguese. A top 10 music market has just said thank you and good night to the English language. Chris Dalla Riva, your thoughts?
I think it's important for people that we don't have an example of this to show here, but if you go look at Brazilian charts 10 years ago or 20 years ago, of course you're going to see some Brazilian stars, but there are so many more American acts, and you see this around the world. And again, I mean, I believe Will pointed this out to me. That was mostly a function of just the economies of scale of having to ship physical media around the world and the biggest record labels being based in English speaking countries. But it really hammers home the point when you could see it in our paper, but really for any country, if you go back not that far, you see how powerful or how much power English speaking artists had around the world, and they just don't anymore. I guess other than Lady Gaga right now. But
I'm really glad.
she's at 85 too. It's not like she's in the top 10.
Yeah, I rehearsed that last week and she wasn't there. So I'm glad we had at least one to talk about. But let's be clear, I don't want to be taking people with knee-jerk reactions of doom and gloom here. I think Oasis are doing like 8 shows in Brazil next month. So there's demand for heritage English language music. But if you're going to try and break a new band, good luck breaking that new English language band in Brazil. In fact, good luck breaking that new English language band in Latin America. They're looking after their own now. Trade, there's a trade war going on. Trade in our world, I believe, is drying up. Let me turn to one last thing on globalization, and then we could take a pause. And Chris, if you can pull out any questions, this is great. Big country, Brazil. Big country, America. Big country, Britain. These are big music markets. I'm going to go to a small one. I'm going to go to Denmark. Okay, I did a bunch of work in Denmark last year in the area of gender and music. First time I've worked on that topic. Fascinating how serious they take that issue in Denmark. It's not a token gesture, it really matters. And then I looked at the charts in Denmark. 9 of the top 10 artists in Denmark were Danish performing in Danish. Now, let's be clear, other than 5.5 million Danes and maybe some Eskimos in Greenland, nobody else speaks Danish. The Swedes don't understand Danish. The Norwegians don't understand Danish. Only Danes understand Danish. So I'm asking myself, why is it happening there? Makes no sense. If you sang in English, those Swedish fans across the bridge would be able to understand your lyrical content. I probed it, dug around, does what Chris de la Riva does best, never stop asking questions. And I meet this really smart data scientist who introduces another tongue-twisting expression. He called it linguistic protectionism. Danish artists know that if they all rap in Danish or they all write and perform in Danish, they keep the M&Ms and the Lana Del Reys out of their market. So when the festivals come around in the summer where you can make some serious cabbage, they're Danish language festivals with some English language bands on the bill. What's your thoughts on that?
I think it is, you know what, actually, to reframe what I was about to say, something you pointed out to me when we were initially talking about this was in countries like France and Canada, they had these protectionist laws to be like, oh, in Canada, every hour on the radio, you have to play a certain number of Canadian acts. And what we've seen is that the free market in this case has actually done a better job at protecting local acts than any government act possibly could, because many of these countries did not have these cultural protectionist laws. So I think it's very powerful that you're seeing that in even smaller countries where, like you said, only there are not many people speaking Danish outside the borders of that country. Um, so it's a good example of ways in which the free market can benefit local culture, and goes against the idea that, it's always going to flatten or homogenize local culture.
If I can put a pin in that one by saying, rather than get what you're given on broadcast, consumers choose what they want on streaming. And what they
Yeah.
want is what's local, closest to home. And the Canadian example, I think it's 35% of Canadian radio airplay has to be Canadian content. Make two quick points on that. Point one, that means that radio stations have to look at passports before they create playlists. Is Brian Adams Canadian? Of course he's Canadian. Proud Vancouver Canadian. No, he's not, because three-quarters of his band are American, therefore he doesn't qualify. And the other one, which I thought was so funny, is I learned this example of a commercial radio station which was hit with the Canadian quota. So you know what they did? They played Nickelback from midnight till 7 a.m. every day. I filled out my quota. You didn't have to say anyone was listening, but you can see how policy interventions, can do more harm than good. But to your point, the French charts are more French in the free market streaming than they ever were in the regulated market of sales and radio.
Yeah.
That's a fascinating policy anomaly, which we may want to take some questions on. Now, if you can take a quick look at the chat bar, I'll just reveal to this audience I'm partially sighted, so without my monitor, I won't be able to read it. But any questions on this that we want to tackle straight away before I move you forward?
Someone mentioned oh, I don't know if we know the answer to this, but what would Joni Mitchell be considered who has dual citizenship? But again, I don't know the answer. Maybe you do, Will, but I think it's
Yeah.
another good example of what you're saying is that you end up having to look at passports of all these artists when you're making programming decisions, which is, a hard, difficult system to maintain and probably leads to some arbitrary outcomes.
Yeah, I mean, I love A, I love Canada, and B, I love my Canadian people, and I see I'm missing the country a lot. Any Canadians in the call, I want to come back and see you guys. But I empathize with the Canadian dilemma of what is Canadian. Back to Bryan Adams in the early 90s being declared American because too many band members were from south of that border. Crowded House are deemed Australian. If you look at the Illuminate database, that would upset New Zealanders. That caused a World War III down in the South Pacific. And then if you come from Scotland, we've got a 900-pound gorilla south of our border, just like Canada has a 900-pound gorilla south of their border. Only our gorilla doesn't carry guns. But in that situation, I think it's interesting to say, is there a role for nationality when you discuss the arts, or should you just listen to the music? Tagging people is an interesting concept, no?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, listen, I'm all for supporting local arts. I don't think there's anything specifically wrong with doing that, but someone mentioned in the chats, these policy interventions can sometimes have adverse or strange outcomes.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean you should, I don't think that means you shouldn't invest in promoting local culture or creating grants for artists to use, but that doesn't necessarily mean, even if you try to force them, that they will be heard more often or that listeners are going to seek them out.
Yeah, and that's why I say if you're English speaking and non-American, you're kind of screwed. There is a role for the state in Australia, in Britain, in Canada, and Canada's so much. Canada's tour support model, whenever we look at festival posters here in the UK, we always say I can see more Canadians than Americans. Why? Because the government's given them a leg up that ladder, which is really,
Mhm.
really interesting. Any other questions on this unpronounceable G word that you want to flag up?
Um, let's see. Someone here mentioned how the French market always had a degree of localism on their charts, which I do think is the truth in that major labels who had large offices in certain countries like France historically did have a larger portion of local talent than say, the Danish market who might have not have had as big a representative at the label. But I still think you do see or at least when we were looking at this, you still saw this localizing impact where there were even more French artists on the charts. Um, than there had been a decade or 2 decades ago.
And more importantly, topping the charts as well. That's the
Yes.
interesting thing. You can measure
Yes.
a market, but the market doesn't move culture. The top 10 or the top 20 moves culture. And what's moving at the top of the charts is clearly across the continent of Europe and Latin America. And the more we look, the more we'll find it is local artists. Um, One discovery on globalization, which came from this year's Global Value of Copyright report, which to stress is on my website, Pivotal Economics. The website is there to educate and inform and inspire. The presentation is there if you want to borrow the slides, use and abuse them at will. But I looked at what's going on in Canada on streaming. And if I said to you, the number one language being streamed in Canada today is English, you'd say, duh, no shit, Sherlock, presumably. What if I asked you what the second most streamed language in Canada today is? What would be your guess?
Well, I have a guess, but I feel like it's probably some sort of Indian language.
It's Punjabi,
Yes. I know
then
this through my
Spanish,
job. We have a huge
then
Punjabi
French.
population on Audio Mac in Canada. Um,
Yeah.
so if you look at the Canadian charts on Audio Mac, you see ton of Punjabi music, which in
Hmm.
that sense, that is still a localizing. There is still localization there because there has been a huge there's been a ton of immigration from India to Canada. So that's what the local culture is in those regions.
Yeah. And again, you define the word localization in real time. There'll be comments from the floor which will help us do that. But that's the rise of local language Indian content wherever Indians can be found.
Yes.
And the work I looked at three particular artists, Shub, Karan Arjula, and AP Dillon, who, by the way, this is not a token gesture. The Punjabi music coming out of Canada is banging. I listen to it without any prompting. Icky is another great one. But these three artists are doing better in India on their country rank than they are in Canada. So let me just stress there are artists like Shub who are around about the 100th ranked artist in Canada. That's very respectable. You think about the wealth of talent in Canada, Avril Lavigne, they're 100th most popular artist in Canada. Whereas in India, a country with 33 times the populace, they're 50th. So you have this one record label on the outskirts of Toronto that's cracked diaspora. Our Punjabi music industry has broken Punjabi artists in Canada and done an even better job back in India. And that, for me, speaks volumes about the value of immigration to society. You think the tax revenue of those Indian royalties flowing back into Canada, there's all that economic argument. Park that for a second. For art and culture, do you not think the diasporas around the world is a big untapped opportunity for this industry? I mean, there'll be record labels on this call thinking, how did they spot that? And what's the next diaspora population that should be captured? Do you think there's something there that we've been sleeping on?
I mean, I think the Canada example is a perfect example of how you can tap into those diaspora populations and really spread styles that at one time were just associated with one part of the world to other parts of the world. I think we also at in my job, Audio Mac's very popular in Africa, and West African music that people typically refer to as Afro beats has started to break in some other countries. We've seen some stars start to cross over in the US and the UK, and it's this we see the same thing. There is a big Nigerian population in Germany, and the German charts on Audiomack often contain tons of Afrobeat music. So I always tell people to look to West Africa because it's a huge population center, it's a huge cultural center. There are diaspora populations around the world. I really think in the next 5 to 10 years, you're going to see global pop stars who come out of Nigeria in the same way we've seen a lot of Latin artists cross over in the last decade.
Yeah, I was about to frown at when you said Afro beats because as a DJ, my music is Afro beat without the S.
Yes.
Really actually play the instruments. So Orlando Julius, for example, and the first and last documentary I ever made, because clearing the rights was a nightmare, was a tribute to the rise, fall, and resurgence of highlife music from Ghana, which for the Americans in this call has got a fascinating story because James Brown needs no introduction, was from the Frafraf tribe in northern Ghana. and was trying to reflect his tribal roots with call and response. Huh, give it to me, this type of call and response. And then you have all these Ghanaian highlife artists who are trying to imitate James Brown. So there's this very interesting feedback effect that we explored. And it's a great example of how music doesn't see borders in many ways, in many
What was
ways.
that documentary called?
Black Stars of High Life.
Oh, cool.
It's available on YouTube until we get the first copyright claim. But we spent 3 years making it and 6 years trying to clear the rights. It was a nightmare. Don't make documentaries if you don't want grey hair, is my recommendation to the audience. Any other questions? I saw there was something about Brian Adams there. If it was clarity, I would appreciate it.
Yeah, let me see. There were a couple questions of um I don't know if I'm gonna be able to find it. Oh, it was just an observation that Brian Adams and some other global Canadian stars mostly record outside of Canada and
Yeah.
with non-Canadian songwriters.
And that's a great example I can build on for a personal perspective. I'm from Scotland, very proud to be Scottish, but I have to move to London to make it in the music industry. If you're Canadian, if you're a Canadian country music songwriter, and there's some great country music coming out of Canada, and you leave for Nashville, where Tom is from, should you be declined Canadian citizenship from the perspective of the music business? Should you lose that factor funding? Um, that's where the rubber hits the road when you try and intervene in a music market with your policies as
Yeah.
well. And there was also a remark about MENA I can just toss out there. I've done a lot of work looking at the MENA region, Egypt, Turkey, Dubai, Saudi, beyond. And Arabic is one of the most commonly streamed languages across the continent of Europe. It's not that high in any single country, but because there's lots of
Yeah.
little bits of Arabic in all of these countries, it all adds up. So when you think about Europe as an aggregate, English, local language, Arabic, I think Arabic is now the third or the fourth most streamed language in France, which is interesting. Now, when I say that, there'll be a lot of record labels on this call thinking, what did he say? I'm telling you, you got to look at these signals. And if I can shout out Luminate Data here, who have spent the past 3, 4 years moving that entire data set onto a modern platform, you can do this work quite easily. Get a good data scientist to chop those rows and columns. Example, country of origin and language. I can look at the Spanish chart and say, how much of that is Spanish Spanish and how much of that is Spanish non-Spanish? And guess what? Non-Spanish Spanish speakers dominate the chart, then Spanish Spanish speakers, and in third place, bronze, is the English language repertoire, pushed to the bottom of the charts. Taylor Swift isn't there. You know, you just close off localization with a quick observation from Spain, spend a lot of time in Spain. Taylor Swift did 2 nights at the Santiago Bernabeu Stadium in Madrid, 2 nights with advertising. Okay, so that's a Real Madrid stadium with successful football team, soccer team for Americans on this call. In history, she sold out 2 nights with advertising. Carol G, who Carol G did 4 nights without advertising and wasn't allowed to do a fifth. Same stadium. I
Wow.
want this audience to think about this. I can frame it for this inquisitive minds listening in to try and explain what's going on. Let's park that and we'll soak up a few more questions towards the end. But in the time that we've got left there, let's turn to your Substack and then let's turn to your book. When did you start the Substack and how popular has it been?
I think I started the Substack like 4 years ago, and this, like I said, I had this article go very viral about key changes, and I was like, oh, I should create a place where people could follow me because it seems like more people are interested in what I thought were niche musical ideas. Um, so I created this newsletter about 4 years ago. It's called Can't Get Much Higher, and the tagline is the intersection of music and data. So usually I'm writing about music, and there's a chart somewhere in there. And I've had a lot of fun with it. I've grown a lot over the last couple of years. I think we're about at 9,000 subscribers. And I do usually two pieces a week. One is Chris answers whatever musical questions on his mind. And the second's usually an interview. Will and I have done an interview before, did an interview with some of his friends from a Swedish songwriting society,
Yeah.
collection society, and got to get to speak to a lot of cool industry people there. So I think if you're interested in music, and data together or apart, it's a nice destination for you online.
And it's conversational. You write, does this sound right? The way that you write makes me want to read it with a cup of coffee in my hand. because it feels
That
like I'm in a coffee shop listening to someone. It's very, very clever. But let's just pick up on that subscriber number. You said 9,000 people. I mean, I subscribe to them all. Music Ally, Music Business Worldwide, everybody in this call will do the same. But you, weirdly, have come through the back door to become my go-to. But there's something else there, which is Substack is having a moment. If I release an exclusive figure to this audience, for this audience only, Substack today is getting to more people than the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the Guardian, the Economist, and the FT combined. Press pause and think about that. It's having its day in the sun right now. It's tearing it. Something's happened in the water. Had we met this time last year, we wouldn't be discussing Substack. So I wrote a joke. I used to say that more people listen to Joe Rogan than buy newspapers in America, which is still factually correct. Now more people read Substack than listen to Joe Rogan, which is a little bit ironic. Um, it's crazy. What has Substack done to give it its lilt?
I mean, Substack is, I have almost nothing but praise for the people at Substack because they just built a really great publishing platform. It's very, for me at least, I'll go right in there, write whatever I'm saying, and it makes it very easy to send out however many emails you want to a week. It's free, so anyone can go on there. I'm curious what their economics look like and what they will look like long term because I assume you can't send out millions of free emails every week for people forever. But I think the magic that Substack's really tapped into is they've put a social network on top of this newsletter platform, which some people get mad about, but it's created very, very strong network effects that I don't think other newsletter platforms like Beehive or Ghost have really been able to compete with. And I've spoken to Substack takes 10% of your revenues. And I've spoken to some people that have pretty big Substacks. I'm like, why don't you leave? Like you could go to Beehive and you're just paying a flat fee every year. And they're like, the network effects are just so strong. It's they don't want to lose that. And I think that's sort of their secret sauce. They have great newsletter publishing tools, but everyone sticks around because it's a great way to continue to grow your audience too.
It's incredible. And it is, if there's anybody from the newspaper and magazine world on this call, this is your Napster moment, baby. And you're seeing it happen. Derek Thompson, prestigious journalist from The Atlantic, they pay good comp. Just left The Atlantic to go to Substack. The bundle is being unbundled. We've seen this times before, music industry executives who have been in the business for a few decades. And now we're seeing it again in a different media vertical. I really stress it's one to watch. And Tom, to note, we should get Chris Best on the smartest people in the room and interrogate him as to what this platform is set to achieve. Let's go to your book. We have the 10-minute warning ringing the bell. I'm framing it this way. There's lots of books. There's lots of books. There's lots of songs. There's lots of books. I'm in an airport. I know my flight's going to be called in 20 minutes from now. And I'm looking at WH Smith's or in America, Hudson Travel. They sell magazines, they sell newspapers, and they got a big bookshelf. Why should me and we on this call pick your book?
Well, of course, I think there's a million reasons you should pick up my book, but I think the big thing is I say it's a data-driven history of popular music. It goes from 1958 to 2025. And because of that big time scope, whether you were dancing the twist or the Dougie at your senior dance and your dance in high school, there is something in this book for you. And I take all the biggest artists that you're familiar with, the biggest songs, and I make you think about them in a new way. I apply data analytics to the stories that we're all familiar with and really interrogate if they hold up to statistical scrutiny. So I think it provides a new way to look at everything you are already familiar with. Tom said in the chat, give us an example. Here's one I talk about sometimes is that the story of the 1960s is the Beatles arrive in America. They're already popular in Europe. And because they write their own songs, everyone else starts writing their own songs if you want to be taken seriously as an artist. And there's certainly a lot of truth to this story. Countless artists have said the Beatles were writing their own songs. I had to write my own songs. But what I did was I went back all the way to 1940 and I looked at the number one song on the Billboard charts going back that far. And I said, how often was the artist writing their song that got to number one? And what you see is a decade before the Beatles land in America, there's a sharp increase in artists who are writing their own songs. So the Beatles, of course, were impactful in how many artists write their own songs, but at the same time, they were part of a longer lineage, the Little Richards and Chuck Berrys of the world who were already composing their own music. And I think that, it's a simple example, but it goes against what you often hear about the history of the Beatles and the history of popular music of that era and why people started composing their own songs. And I sort of do this era by era throughout the book, but that's an example that I've always enjoyed.
And the fact they called it Lennon and McCartney means the Beatles' repertoire stays in copyright for 70 years after Paul McCartney's death, when that tragic day happens. And the reason it was framed that way is because Lennon wanted to be first because of the alphabet as well. So you have the same thing with the Gershwin brothers too, as well. Is there any other questions? Because I was going to return that serve with my favorite story from my own book, which will take 2 or 3 minutes. But is there any more questions in the chat bar for us?
I mean, there are a couple. One I saw earlier that was sort of interesting. This goes back to some of the globalization stuff, asking about if touring has seen a globalizing effect in the same way the recorded business has. I haven't thought about this too deeply, but I don't know if you have.
Yeah, I'll give you two angles on that. One, if you're a local record label, part of a major or an independent, and you can break your artists locally, and you'll hear this in Sweden. The first country to adopt Spotify. I was there many times the previous couple of months. The record labels there will sign you to break you in Sweden, and the borders constrain where you're going to go. We're not going to try and take you anywhere else because they're not listening to you anywhere else. Now, that could be bad because you want to be a global pop star, but then again, you can ask the question, how much is enough? If you can make the numbers work in Sweden, and if you just want to tour in Sweden, you don't take on that extra risk and then extra cost of trying to break an artist globally. So if I can paraphrase it as, I'd rather be a big fish in a small pool than a minuscule irrelevant fish in a gigantic, humongous, ever-expanding pool. And a lot of people, I think, are beginning to take that choice, big fish, small pool, and
Yeah.
they're content with that as well. And then one last footnote to that answer is I looked at the stadiums report in a trade publication called IQ Magazine, fantastic publication if you're in the live music industry, and the growth of stadium festivals, stadium shows, should I say. And I think 1 and 2 artists filling stadiums last year were American. So only the law of large numbers, the big boy, the Americans, can produce artists big enough to fill those big stadiums. And a lot of those artists that are coming through now came from Disney and Nickelodeon. You think about Ariana Grande, Olivia Rodrigo, Sabrina Carpenter. That's the boot camp which is producing. Do you remember that expression, household names? I think that's a very interesting development when we discuss who's coming through those ranks as well. Any other questions there to pick up?
Uh, I think I know you said you wanted to say something about Tarzan economics or pivot. So I think now's a good time to.
I would flag your book, but Amazon hasn't put it through my letterbox yet. All I've
No,
got
I
is
don't.
a PDF
I
that
don't
I
even
printed
have it
off.
yet either.
A huge expense to the forest. Well, maybe just to close it out, and I'll hand it back to Tom from my book. One very Chris Dalla Riva observation from my book was I looked at the attention economy. Attention is scarce. We all want more of it. So when somebody wins, that means everyone else loses because there's less time to go around. Impose constraint and apply the economics. And I looked how attention economics was affecting songwriting with two observations. In an age of streaming, one, songs are getting shorter. No longer 4.5 minutes or even 3.5 minutes. A lot of songs are done and dusted before 2.5 minutes is up. Lil Nas X, Old Town Road, fades out after 2 minutes and 8 seconds. If you go back to the Irish band U2, quick joke, what's the difference between God and Bono? God doesn't think he's Bono. If you go back to U2, their greatest song ever, Where the Streets Have No Name, you don't hear the chorus until 2 minutes, 9 seconds. Lil Nas X has left the building before the chorus comes in. So songs are getting shorter. I also observed that the chorus in songs is being moved to the front, which is
Mm,
interesting. So
yeah.
the songs are getting shorter, the chorus is moving to the front. Now, if I use that American expression, the tail that wags the dog, the rules of streaming are affecting songwriting. How can you say that, Will? because you don't get paid unless you've been played for 30 uninterrupted seconds. So it makes perfect sense to put the chorus at the front. Avicii was doing this in 2013 in the early days of Spotify. And you don't get paid a penny more for lasting a second more. So where's the incentive to write longer songs? I've seen big hip hop albums by the likes of Drake, which have got 20, 30, 40 songs in them. Some of them are just 41-second skits. You see what's going on?
Yeah.
Now, at that point, people think, oh my God, streaming is killing culture. Streaming is to blame for the mortgages, cost of mortgages. Streaming is to blame for the war in Ukraine. And everyone goes crazy about streaming. But I always like to say, to quote Mark Twain, history doesn't repeat itself, but it sure hell rhymes. When you go back to the jukebox in America, Chris, back in the 1950s and 60s, it was run by those wonderfully friendly people called the Mafia. And the Mafia stipulated that no song lasting more than 2 minutes 30 seconds was allowed in the jukebox. Why? Because shorter songs maximize revenue from on-demand music. And I just want to leave the audience with that example of when we see disruption, what I try and do in my book is to remind the reader that we've seen it before
Yeah.
and we got through it. So have the confidence to let go of the old wine and reach out to the new. On that, we're close to the hour mark. So let me bring in Tom and see if there's any further questions we can tackle from this audience. And thank you for all the questions to date.
I don't want to come back in. I want you guys to keep going. This is fascinating. Truly remarkable. Chris, I posed a question in here a minute ago. I'd be curious just to get your high level view of it. What percentage of popular music, or shall we say top songs of this decade, would you say are solely written by the artist as opposed to by committee?
Uh,
I
um,
put
Close to zero. Most songs are written by committee these days. Almost always these days, the performing artist gets a songwriting credit. Now, I don't know what all these artists are doing on these songs. I think artists are a bit more sophisticated these days and know that if you want to collect royalties, you need to have a credit on the songs. Um, but solo songwriting it is not common. I mean, occasionally you'll see a duo. A lot of those Olivia Rodrigo songs are two people, Chappell Roan. Adele songs usually are only two writers, Hozier maybe. But I don't know. Outside of Ed Sheeran, you're not really seeing solo credits on huge pop hits.
Yeah.
put the over under at 20%. Clearly, I was way off.
Yeah, I might have to put the over under at like 1% or
Wow,
something.
that's
If I can
frightening.
toss two remarks here, Chris has actually written about this subject beautifully in a way that only he can. For even the art side of this business, as opposed to the industry side, just that's an intuitive question to ask. And Chris has already crunched the data to show how Grammy winners typically have 8, 10, 12 songwriter credits on it. And secondly, the value of getting it on the publishing was explained to me as a 10, 11-year-old who's traveling down to London to see my aunt Doreen Loader, who ran Ensign Records with Nigel Grange, Lucian's half brother, and Chris Hill. And sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but we learned today that we lost Chris Hill, so it's pertinent for me to share this story. But I always remember Doreen saying to me, now, the difference between record labels and publishing is the record label pays for your drugs and the publishing pays for your pension. I thought that's a beautiful lesson to learn about upfront cash versus downstream income.
Wow. Will, you've got so many great quotes here. The one you mentioned a moment ago about history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. I mean, that's genius.
It does rhyme.
I'll give you one more Will Pages, and this is one of my favorite quotes from his book, and I think it's a nice way to sign off here. He says, "Music got there first. Music was the first to suffer and the first to recover from the forces of deep technological disruption, making it something we can all learn from." And that's Will pointed out to me, but music always seems to get hit by whatever the technology is first, and then all the other industries get hit a couple years later, but music has already sort of figured it out. So keep your eye on the music industry.
Yeah, for anyone outside of our business on the call, it's a microcosm. It's a bellwether, a smoke signal for the shape of things to come.
Well, gentlemen, at the top of the show, I introduced you all as the literal definition of the name of this platform, the smartest people in the room, and you lived up to that billing. I can't thank you enough for what you do to help the rest of us idiots out here understand what the hell's going on in the music industry. Um, the audience, I promised you'd leave smarter and more enlightened today. I guarantee you that is true. And I just want to say, in this particularly crazy time, just be nice to each other. and listen to more music and go hear more live shows. We'll see you, folks.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Cheers.